Hegel's transcendental logic. Welcome. Hi, my name is Wani. I'm a philosophy student at La Sorbonne, and today I'll be sharing with you my commentary for my finals on Hegel, which I got an 18 for. When I spoke to my friend and I was trying to be like, yeah, we're all not just our grade, he was just like, well, it's like the mafia. When it's high enough, everyone pays attention. This video will basically explain Hegel's transcendental logic with an illustration of the master and slave dialectic. I was extremely ambitious. It paid off. It's a schematic comparison or application of the two processes. First, the dialectical process, which is formal. The second, which is the process of life, which is ontological, and how it is that I tied them together from the mediation that is negation or Aufhebung. The main references for this paper that I wrote was Kojèv's The Introduction to the Reading of Hegel. I have 2 other videos on this, and Zizek's Less Than Nothing. So that is essentially what we're going to go through today. The video is going to be broken down into 3 parts. The first would be the context of the commentary. I know some people are interested in actually the process of being a philosophy student. And the second part of the video would be me just reading through the text that we're supposed to comment on. I'll do it in French and I'll translate it in English. And the interesting thing is that it absolutely makes no sense to me in English. Because I obviously read everything in French because that's the book that we have in school and that's how we're taught, like everything's in French, but I always talk about the issues with language, but we still do our best. And the last part of this video, which is the third part, would be my full commentary in English. And I will interject myself when necessary. I'll try not to though, so that you can actually get the idea of what it is that I actually wrote to actually get this grade, and not like a cleaner version that wasn't part of the exam conditions and not part of actually what I wrote during that time. And let's just begin. The first thing I'll talk about is the context. The fact that this is only 2 sentences. This is extremely significant because usually we get about 20 to 30 lines to actually comment on, and here we have 6, not even 6, barely 6. Yeah, 5.5 lines to comment on, and I wrote 10 pages. Oh, and well, 9.5. What happens in the exams, everyone gets the same packet, so you can actually do something that's not the class that you sat in on. So a lot of my friends didn't actually do Nietzsche, but a lot of them decided to do Spinoza or some other author. So because we all get this packet, my friend like read the thing for Hegel and she was just like, I understood absolutely nothing. And it's funny because I wonder if I would understand what I wrote a few years from now, but we're here today, so hopefully I wouldn't have to read it and I'll hear myself explain it, so I will remember all the effort that I put into getting this grade. Oh, and just the note about the grade, right? The main thing and the satisfying thing for me is that in taking this class from this professor, I really respect the way he actually understands Hegel, and I learned a lot from how it is that he understands or how he teaches Hegel. I see a lot clearer how it is that it has its influences, obviously, on Marx and on Lacan. So based on that, the fact that a person who I respect in terms of the way he sees the reading or understands or interprets Hegel, and the fact that my writing seems to be in alignment with that, it's more of like, oh, I know I'm on the right path. Because the thing about philosophy is, even if you think you know, you write the paper and you realize you don't know. Like, if you have a good professor, they'll explain to you how it is that you actually, went sideways according to their interpretation of whatever it is you're learning. If you have a horrible professor, they will insult you, actually. I'm not going to go too much into that. But the middle part, which is extremely unhelpful, is that you get no notes, or it's like just no. So moving on, the next thing I wanted to talk about is how this was really ambitious, because of how complex it was and how it was the only way that it could really make sense to me was that I not only wanted to explain the dialectic, because the other question that we had was, what is desire according to Hegel? And you're like, that is so massive. Like, you can write so much. And I was just like, no, I need focus. So it was really good that we had this text to work on. But the ambition was that you didn't really have to do both. The text did not ask for the master-slave dialectic, but I just felt like for myself to have a concrete picture of what it is that I'm saying, I needed to see it in 2 schemas. So I not only explained Hegel's transcendental logic, I explained the process of life, and I explained it through the illustration of one of the functions of life, and then the second function of life, which is the dialectic between the master and the slave. So it was extremely ambitious. I actually had a bit of a difficulty at the beginning. I was going to say a lot of difficulty at the beginning to actually try to figure out which was who. And then at some point it made sense to me to go, okay, self-consciousness, Selbstbewusstsein is the slave, and Bewusstsein, which is consciousness, is the master. And at first it didn't make sense, but I just had to find a way to find the through line, and that really helped me explain the text. The other thing I wanted to talk about was how risky it was with my final line. You'll see why, because my professor is German, and also when it's such a big statement like that, it could come across as cliche. Just moving on to the last part of the context of this dissertation, a note on language. It was very difficult for me to translate it into English because in French, when you refer to an object, I have an example here, but you know, when you say desire is his or her desire, the possessive article, I think it's called, and in French, it's based on the gender of the actual noun. So desire is masculine, you always refer to it as son désir, so the masculine possessive term of desire. It's not like ça et son désir. It's about desire itself, its own gender. Then I had to decide, like, do I say like its desire or their desire or his desire? I guess I'll take the woke route of doing the plural form, mainly because I think if we don't adapt philosophy, it will die. So we will not update it, but we will adapt it. Moving on to the second part of this video, which is me reading the text and translating it. La conscience de soi est objet pour la conscience. And I'm not reading this in German because I tried looking for it, I couldn't find it, or I didn't try hard enough. And I don't have the feeling that a lot of people are actually invested enough to care about the German. So it is what it is. La conscience de soi est objet pour la conscience. Self-consciousness is object for consciousness. Objet qui pose soi-même son propre être autre. Object which poses in itself its own other being. Just a quick note on the word pose. Reading Zizek, I realized that pose could either be posits or pose. I'm just going to use pose to be, what do you call it? Conservative with my translation, but I have a feeling that it's more of posit. Ou qui pose la différence comme nulle et s'y maintient. Or which poses the difference as null and remains there or maintains itself. Again, sorry for my English translation, but this is how I can do it. You can see like I'm in pain. La figure particulière seulement vivante dont le processus de vie relève elle aussi sa propre subsistance, mais avec sa différence, elle cesse d'être ce qu'elle est. The particular figure only living in the process of life raises or elevates also itself, its own subsistence, but with its difference, it ceases to be what it is. L'objet de la conscience de soi, au contraire, se maintient dans cette négativité de soi-même. The object of self-consciousness, on the contrary, maintains itself in the negativity of itself. C'est ainsi qu'il est genre pour lui-même, fluidité générale dans sa particularisation même. Il est conscience de soi vivante. It is in this way that it is type, genre, for itself, general fluidity in its own particularization. It is the living self-consciousness. Let us begin the commentary. This part of the text comes from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, more precisely chapter 4, The Truth of Self-Consciousness. This particularly dense fragment focuses mainly on the functioning of Hegel's transcendental logic in relation to his logical conception of life. Under the optics of transcendental logic, as opposed to classical logic, the apparent contradiction often encountered is precisely what sets off the Hegelian dialectical movement. That is, a movement introduced by mediation, which has a negating character, or as Kojève puts it in L'Introduction, the introduction of the reading of Hegel, the negating act in this dialectical process is in fact a creative act. In this way, going through or demonstrating the logical structure from the Hegelian point of view does not result in the unification of two opposites, a contradiction, but rather in a synthesis or elevation of these two elements that have transcended their initial opposition. In contrast to the transcendental philosophy proposed by his predecessor, Kant, Zizek describes the Hegelian approach not as one of anticipation, that is, the capacity of the transcendental subject to anticipate the laws of nature by deducing them from his own structure, the structure of subjectivity as the structure of discourse. In Less Than Nothing, Zizek describes logic as the study of pure notions and metaphysics as the study of ontological structure. He proposes that Hegel's transcendental logic is in fact neither an identity nor a correlation between the two, but rather the interaction between these two domains. This leads us to the definition of the subject as the performative effect of the logical structure that is something produced by the movement of mediation, that is negation aufgehoben, which is the negation of what is immediately given, only for it to be elevated and purified of its inessential elements, and leaving behind as residue what is essential, what is new, what is at once necessary and concrete. In light of this introduction, this essay will attempt to explain or rather elaborate the movement of mediation that demonstrates the elevation of the object of self-consciousness to living self-consciousness. The aim is also to accompany this elaboration with an illustration of Hegel's dialectic of master Herrschaft and slave Knecht in relation to his conception of the subject as desiring subject and his logical structural conception of life. This essay therefore unfolds in 3 moments. In the first moment, consisting of the first sentence, we will examine Hegel's schema of transcendental logic as a difference that is not one, or a difference that does not have one. In French is une différence qui n'en est pas une, but basically saying that there was a difference and then there's no longer one. In this section, we will begin illustrating the dialectic of Herrschaft und Knecht, designating the former as consciousness, Bewusstsein, and the latter as self-consciousness, Selbstbewusstsein. In the second moment, from the beginning of the second sentence up to it ceases to be what it is, we will tackle the Hegelian logical structural conception of life and how the schema of transcendental logic can be applied to the process of life, where the subject is taken as desiring subject of life. Subject of logic, desiring subject of life, or the intersubjectivity. Here we will continue the illustration of the master and slave with what is called the fight to the death. In French, it's Lutte, which is struggle, but it's translated as fight, or Kampf auf Leben und Tod. Finally, in the third moment, the latter half of the second sentence, we will highlight how the desiring subject who dominates the other desire, that is, the master, arrives at an existential impasse, while the desire initially dominated in this dialectic, that is, the slave, manages to satisfy their desire, the human desire, which is the affirmation of one's human value in life, that is, the recognition of one's existence. Let us examine the first part of the sentence of the text. Self-consciousness is an object for consciousness. Here we begin with the opposition between the subject, consciousness, Bewusstsein, and its object, self-consciousness, Selbstbewusstsein, of which it is conscious or aware of. In Less Than Nothing, Zizek describes the opposition between the subject and the heterogeneity of its object as the starting point of the Hegelian dialectic, that is, the Hegelian transcendental logic. This opposition triggers the return of the subject to itself, not however in the Cartesian sense, that is to say in a reflexive manner, but dialectically, in a dialectic manner, meaning a reexamination of its own internal structure. This reexamination is thus necessitated by the contradiction that arises simultaneously as the subject becomes aware of its object, namely the opposition between subject and object. It is therefore necessary to trace the schema of transcendental logic to demonstrate how a contradiction can arrive, which Kojève describes ibid as a creative act within the dialectical process, a process that leads to something entirely new and yet at the same time remains related to what is negated, that is the immediacy given at the point of departure as object, or the Gegenstand, that which stands against or opposes the subject. The reason why I articulated this is because Zizek has 2 definitions of immediacy. Let us observe the difference between the 2 ways of representing the relation between subject and object. Here we are looking at logical structures discourse. So classical logic, you have subject and object. Transcendental logic, you have subject-object, which is the moment where the subject that sees the object. Then you have the second moment where the object becomes the object that sees the subject. And then the third moment is that subject that is being seen by the object is actually subject prime, like we call it S prime, which is basically the subject that takes itself as an object. Oh, I'm not supposed to explain this. I guess I'll just finish it because I already started. So we basically see that through these 3 moments in transcendental logic, you arrive at this thing called self-consciousness. Yes. The schema of transcendental logic demonstrates how one arrives at the definition of self-consciousness, Selbstbewusstsein, as the subject that takes itself as object. The contradiction no longer exists because the movement is divided into logical stages or steps that shows the return to the internal structure of subjectivity as the transformation of the subject through this dialectic, understood as the passage from Bewusstsein, the initial S, the first subject that we had, to Selbstbewusstsein, so self-consciousness at the end. It is through the opposition of the object that the subject manages to transcend itself, that is to say, through the creative self-negation that gives rise to its own change. The second part of the first sentence describes the necessary condition of the object that opposes the subject. The subject posits itself or poses within itself its own other being. This characteristic not only introduces the distinction between subject and object, that is, the difference, but also is the means in which the object transcends the subject, as it is posited or posed in itself, that is, as something that surpasses, the word I used in French is dépasser, the thing that surpasses or is beyond or out of reach or out of grasp of the subject. As Kojève Ibid explains, the object resists being the besitz or possession of the subject. The concept of difference exemplifies the movement of mediation as what we have already mentioned, what necessitates the return to the internal structure of subjectivity. Reason being that this difference between subject and object is introduced by the subject itself. In other words, through this mediation carried out by the subject, by distinguishing itself as subject from its object, the subject now has two functions instead of one. So here's a schema that I drew out. Function 1 is the subject introduces the difference, the D, by distinguishing its opposition to the object. The second function, the subject performs the synthesis that results in the emergence of the subject as Selbstbewusstsein, as self-consciousness. We thus observe the first function that demonstrates the difference between what is null, dare I say nothing, that is what is negated by the mediation of the subject, and at the same time is what remains there, s'y maintient. It's difficult, whatever is maintained, whatever is left, the residue. In other words, the elevation through the subject's transcendence of this opposition is produced by the second function of the subject, that is the negation of a negation, the difference of the difference, the split, divided, doubled subject that is self-referential, S prime in relation to S, self-consciousness in relation to consciousness, that culminates in the emergence of Selbstbewusstsein. It is in this way that the subject is described as the performative effect of the logical structure, a concrete particularization of the logical process of negation. The last element to be elaborated in this part is the designation of Bewusstsein as master, Herrschaft, and Selbstbewusstsein as the slave connect. This allows us to further illustrate this elaboration of Hegel's transcendental logic. Maybe I'll drink some water. The second movement of the text, the first part of the second sentence up to "it ceases to be what it is," introduces Hegel's logical conception of life. According to Hegel, life is transcendent, i.e., it is that which surpasses or lies beyond perception, and it is encountered contingently, that is, in a body leap. In this way, to live is the continual pursuit of encounters with life as contingent within an intersubjectivity understood as a desiring relation. In other words, the subject is a desiring subject defined by this desire, a radical lack seeking to satisfy this lack. In this way, a desiring subject is a contradiction, a lack that seeks only to escape its own lack by searching for another desiring subject who can serve as the content of this lack, an other who, however, transcends it. In light of this contradiction, we can examine the process of life as desiring a relation under Hegel's schema of transcendental logic. This particular figure only living in the process of life, relève, raise, elevate, asserts the figure also its own subsistence. Examining this part of the sentence, we note the similarity between the dialectical process and the process of life as the process that begins from nothing. That is the subject of logic and the desiring subject of life, and it is through the movement of mediation that we arrive at the creation of content, that is its own subsistence, an objectivity produced by the internal process of subjectivity and logic. The sentence continues, but with its difference, it ceases to be what it is. Here we see the repetition of the idea of content produced through the dialectical process, at once objective and in relation to the subject, immediacy, that is, what is no longer, meaning what has transcended itself as something other than what it is. Let us now introduce the dialectic of the master and slave in the movement of Kampf auf Leben und Tod, the fight to the death. One of the two functions of life, the other being Arbeit or work. So we have subject, object, Bewusstsein, Selbstbewusstsein, Maître, Esclave, Herrschaft, Connect, master-slave. According to Kojève Ibid, the origin of Selbstbewusstsein is desire, but that this desire is more precisely the desire for another desire in the form of recognition, Anerkennung. This recognition is sought through the domination of one desiring subject who, and I use the word in French, supprimer, but it's eliminate, cancel, remove, abolish, the other by forcing them to submit, that is, to renounce the satisfaction of their own desire for recognition. The difference which is introduced to distinguish between the two desires is therefore the absolute master, the thirst of death, l'angoisse de la mort, the fear of death. Through this mediation, the binary relation becomes ternary, when the dominated desiring subject, now as object, renounces their desire for recognition in favor of the desire for life. So there's this schema. So from binary, which is just maître and esclave, which is Herrschaft and Knecht, which is master and slave, to being tertiary, which includes maître absolu, the absolute master, which is l'angoisse de la mort, or the fear of death. The master ignores this absolute master, where the slave actually yields to the absolute master. And it is through yielding to this absolute master, the fear of death, thirst de la mort, three languages now. It is through this fear of death that the slave chooses the desire for life instead of the desire for recognition, in this function which is Kampf auf Leben und Tod, which is the fight to the death. I explain a bit more about human value in relation to this Kampf auf Leben und Tod in my video on human desire, which I'll link down below if you're interested. With the emergence of this third term, the absolute master, death, this mediation therefore negates the desire of the slave, which gives itself as content created by this transformation to the master. Yet, we find ourselves at an impasse in this asymmetrical ternary relation. In other words, the secularity of the Hegelian dialectic is not yet complete. Therefore, we proceed by examining the concept of recognition. Having received recognition for their mastery in terms of maître from the slave. So mastery here in French is maîtrise, and I asked my professor and it works, which is basically maîtrise in terms of the master is known as domination, but maîtrise or mastery for the slave is mastery of something else, and we'll see what that is as it comes up. The recognition that gives content to the master is therefore invalid. In other words, the master still lacks recognition, they remain empty. Kojève Ibid calls this moment the existential impasse of the master, who is unable to satisfy their void or emptiness, and is thus what gives us the sentence, the object of self-consciousness, on the contrary, maintains itself in this negativity of itself. In other words, the master whose sole function is to fight, struggle, lutter, is incapable of transforming anything to obtain objectivity. Put differently, the master maintains only a negative relation to life, having for content a recognition without value and therefore lacking the affirmation of their own existence. The distinction between maître and esclave through the mediation of the maître absolute master is completed differently. The fight is therefore only a state, or more so a catalyst, that allows the transcendence of the slave as a free slave. It is through slavery that the slave fears not the master, but the absolute master, meaning death. It is through this opposition to a truly transcendent and essential object that the slave ceases to be what it is. Therefore, the slave renounces satisfying their own desire for the desire for life, and this desire for life is in fact the appreciation of life. What affirms the positive relation of the slave, i.e. their existence, is to assume slavery, which is necessary to maintain their life. The slave thus renounces their instincts to satisfy their immediate needs by working. This function of life, work, Arbeit, is the mediation through which the slave finds their autonomy in relation to the master. First, the slave cultivates themselves by producing works. And in French, the word that I use is œuvre, and you'll see why. Producing works that serves the master, thereby obtaining their own mastery, maîtrise, which is technique, technie. So when I use the word œuvre, it has connotations of art, and any connotations of art has the connotations of technique. The slave detaches themselves from the master by recognizing the master's castrated state, that is, the master's incapacity and dependence on the slave in order to live. The content of the master's objectivity is therefore slavery, which proves to be an invalid recognition given that the recognition of a slave is not a recognition of an equal, that is, of value. On the other hand, the slave finds their content by relating to their work, œuvre, an object that gains a status of value precisely by being a product of technique, of culture, which is approved by other desiring subjects. I don't know why I use the word approved. I think it has to do with validation, but if you watch my video that I mentioned about human desire, you'll get a better idea of what the sentence means. This autonomy in relation to an alienated object is where the slave finds freedom, the general fluidity within its very particularization. In other words, the slave transcends themselves through their capacity to transform reality by work, Arbeit, which in turn provides the positive affirmation of the slave's existence, a phenomenon correlated with the logical necessity of their position within life as fluidity, allgemeine Flüssigkeit. The same logical necessity produces not simply a subject as Selbstbewusstsein, but one that is living and therefore concrete and vital. We have seen the elaboration of Hegel's transcendental logic supported by the illustration of the master and slave dialectic. We underscored the movement of the mediation that simultaneously transforms the structural relation from a binary to a ternary relation, a movement that creates through negation. Finally, we identified the contradiction in the master-slave dialectic that highlights the existential impasse experienced by the master only to arrive at the completion of the circularity of the Hegelian dialectic in the form of the process through slavery, or more precisely, work, Arbeit, a path that seems contradictory but leads the desiring subject to concrete freedom. The remaining angoisse, fear, Furcht, is that this reminds us of the phrase Arbeit macht frei, work makes one free. But fortunately, the essay ends here. So, yeah. I hope you found this helpful. I thank everyone who's supporting me on my Patreon. And yeah, I'll talk to you guys soon.